which is what you Welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the product requirements matrix, what it is, and how it relates to product development. Where are we heading with this idea? The product requirements matrix, which is what you see on the right-hand side of the slide here, shows the relationship between the market requirements and the product characteristics. The nice thing about the product requirements matrix is that you can put a lot of information all on one convenient map, and that helps us drive the right kinds of product that we need to make customers happy. You'll see where we're going here. Also, if you've ever heard of the term the house of quality, or something known as a QFD, a quality function deployment, this is exactly the same thing, maybe with one slight twist, but more on that later. The product requirements matrix looks like this. It's made up of 6 different sections. In section A, we list all the market requirements, those CCRs. In section B, all the performance metrics, all those things that we did in the last lesson. Then we start to look at the relationship between the performance metrics and the CCRs, and that takes place in section C. We do a competitive analysis to see how the competition is doing on the CCRs, and we highlight that in section D. We then take a look at getting specific about what are the values from a functional standpoint our product needs to be successful. We'll put the ideal values in section E. Product, we can put the actual values, the real values, in section F. But you'll see how all this ties together shortly. I think the best way to do this is to go back to our Boulder Blinky example and just take it one step at a time. Remember, our example is this. You work for Boulder Blinky, a high-end bicycle components company specializing in bike lights. And Boulder Blinky wants to introduce a new light set for commuter cyclists that takes advantage of the latest lighting technology. If you recall from the last lesson, we created a list of CCRs, critical customer requirements, for each of those customer comments or customer statements that the customers told us during the interview process. We then had to rank them numerically according to what we thought was really important and what we thought was less important, based on either how we interpreted the conversation we had with them during the interview, or perhaps they told us directly what was really important. Note that these are just some example CCRs that I came up with. Use the ones that you created for the next few steps, as it will make a lot more sense. Just use what we're going to do here as a way to understand the process. Well, if you remember, from all those CCRs, we created a list of performance metrics. I didn't get a chance to share with you some of mine, but here they are. Metric number 1 takes a look at customer needs number 1, the light brightness issue. Remember, the customer statement had something like, the light needs to be bright. Well, the performance metric would be the light brightness. And how are we going to measure that? We're going to measure that in lumens. Metric number 2, which then aligns with need number 2, says the light is not easily removed from the bike. Now, how are we going to measure that? Let's just measure the time it takes to remove the light from the bike. And then metric number 3, which aligns well with needs number 2 and 3, is the light is easy to remove from the handlebars. And from a measurement standpoint, we can then say, what's the time to remove the light from the bike once again? Metric number 4 addresses needs 1 and 6. The light has 2 settings, low and high. So what's the unit of measurement? Well, this is sort of like a 0 or 1. Let's just say the bike has low and high settings. So either it does, which we would say is yes, or it doesn't, which we would say would be no. Metric number 5 addresses needs 1 and 4. The light maintains the high setting for 2 hours without charging. All we need to do here is measure the time of charge. Metric number 6 addresses need number 5. And our performance metric is the charging cable is a standard item. What constitutes a standard cable design? Well, maybe something ASTM oriented. We can decide that later. And finally, metric number 7 addresses needs 1, 4, and 7. And here the performance metric is the high-low switch is easily accessible. How would we do that? We could measure the time to switch settings from high to low in seconds, maybe even doing it with thick winter gloves. So hopefully you get an idea. These are just some examples of performance metrics and the units that we'll use to measure them. Use the ones that you created, though, for the next few steps. Now is the time we start building our product requirements matrix. Using the master template that I provided for you in course resources, go ahead and fill it out this way. The first thing that we're going to do is put our CCRs here in this area, right under critical customer requirements. At that point, what we're going to do is also include our importance score. For me, The most important CCR is the bike light is bright, which I gave an important score of 30. Then I would just list all the rest of the CCRs that I have, along with their respective important scores. And don't forget, all those important scores need to add up to 100. Next, we're going to put our performance metrics and the units that we're going to use up here. And we're going to lay out all those performance metrics in that row along the top. And once again, you'll find the product requirements template in Course Resources. Just download it, it's an Excel spreadsheet, and you'll be able to follow along with all the details that are coming. Now what? Now we get to think about the relationship between the CCRs and the performance metrics. That goes in that central section of the product requirements matrix. We'll fill in the what versus the how section, also known as the correlation matrix. What we're going to do is use a 9, 3, 1, or 0 scale, where a 9 means the performance metric and the CCR are strongly related, 3 means they're moderately related, 1 means they're weakly related, and a 0 or perhaps a blank means they're just not related at all. So let's take a look at this example. If CCR number 1 was the bike light is bright, and performance metric number 1 is the light brightness measured in lumens, how are these two things related? I would probably say that they're related rather strongly. So when I put all this in there, I would put a 9 where those two things intersect. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video to figure out your relationships between the performance metrics that you came up with and the CCRs that you came up with. Take another 5 or 10 minutes for this one, because we need to have that center section filled out in order to do the next part. Okay, you ready? CCR are strongly related, 3 means they're moderately related, 1 means they're weakly, goes in that central section of the product requirement CCRs that I have, along with their respective important scores. And don't forget, all those important scores need to add up to 100. Next, we're going to put our performance metrics and the units that we're going to use up here. And we're going to lay out all those performance metrics in that row along the top. And once again, you'll find the product requirements template in Course Resources. Just download it, it's an Excel spreadsheet, and you'll be able to follow along with all the details that are coming. Now what? Now we get to think about the relationship between the CCRs and the performance metrics. That goes in that central section of the product requirements matrix. We'll fill in the what versus the how section, also known as the correlation matrix. What we're going to do is use a 9, 3, 1, or 0 scale, where a 9 means the performance metric and the CCR are strongly related, 3 means they're moderately related, 1 means they're weakly related, and a 0 or perhaps a blank means they're just not related at all. So let's take a look at this example. If CCR number 1 was the bike light is bright, and performance metric number 1 is the light brightness measured in lumens, how are these two things related? I would probably say that they're related rather strongly. So when I put all this in there, I would put a 9 where those two things intersect. So what I'd like you to do now is to pause the video to figure out your relationships between the performance metrics that you came up with and the CCRs that you came up with. Take another 5 or 10 minutes for this one, because we need to have that center section filled out in order to do the next part. Okay, you ready? Let's keep going. Now that we have those correlations all set up, we need to do some math. We combine the scores for the performance metrics and the CCRs in this way. Remember, we said the importance score for CCR number 1 was 30 and our correlation score was 9. What we're going to do is multiply those things together to come up with a performance metric score of 270. Okay, now what? Well, the next thing is you just go down the list. You develop the performance score for each one of your CCRs based on its importance score, multiplied by the performance metric that you gave it, and then you just add all those things up as you go down the list. You'll do that for each one of your CCRs and for each one of the performance metrics. What you'll do then is you'll put the total score in this box right down here at the bottom. And that means you add up all the total scores you came up with for performance metric number 1. Then you do the same thing for all the other performance metrics. So you see where we're going here? Once again, I take the importance score for CCR number 1, multiply it times 9, and I get 270. I take the importance score for CCR number 2, multiply it by whatever the correlation score is for performance metric number 1, and come up with that number. I just go right down the column and add all those things up, and that's what goes in that bottom section, as we pointed out here. You do the same thing for each one of the performance metrics. Go right down the column. Then what do? We add all of these up to come up with the total performance metric score. So we add all of those on the row that says performance metric score. That gives us the total over there in that box. So that means we take the performance score for performance metric number 1, add it to the performance score for performance metric number 2, add that to the performance metric for number 3, and you get the idea. Then what do? We have one more step in this section. We calculate the relative importance value, and we put it here for each of the performance metrics. The way that we do that is we just take the performance score for performance metric number 1, and we divide it by the total performance metric score, the one that we just calculated. Multiply that times 100, and you end up with a relative importance score for performance metric number 1 in terms of percent. We would then do exactly the same thing for performance metric number 2. Take its performance metric score and divide that by the total performance metric score that we just calculated. That will give us the relative importance of performance metric number 2 in percent.
You do exactly the same thing for number 3, for number 4, and all the other performance metrics that you might have. This might take a few minutes to figure out, so go ahead and pause the video and calculate everything down to those relative importance values. Take 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and carry on to the next step.
Well, how'd that go? It's a little complicated the first time around, but once you do this once or twice, you'll get the hang of it without any trouble whatsoever. For now, though, let's just take a short break, and when we'll come back, we'll start filling out the rest of the product requirements matrix. I'll see you soon. Okay, let's get back to our product requirements matrix. So far, we filled out the CCRs, the performance metrics, the correlation matrix, and we're able to calculate the performance metric scores as well as their relative importance. Next, we're going to cover the rest of the diagram. The first thing we need to consider is something we call product positioning. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we discuss marketing. This is all about what kind of customer are you trying to attract. In our bike light case, this is all about what kind of light are you trying to produce. For instance, is this a high-end bike light for serious commuters, or is it a low-price bike light built for everyone? This is all about positioning, and you need to decide how you are going to position your product in the market, whether it's based on lowest price, highest performance, greatest ease of use, or perhaps most reliable. The important thing is you position your product based on your company's intrinsic values and your target market. These determine the final design of your product that you hope to sell to your target market. And your positioning also determines who your competition is, who you will benchmark. So let's talk a little bit about that. Defining the competition. This is important because you want to find out what else is going on out there. How does the competition stack up to your CCRs, and then how would you find out? Well, one way to certainly do that is you can find customer and technical reviews for a number of competitive brands, or perhaps just buy them and test them out. What we have here are 3 different fictitious companies and their bike lights. Lights R Us, the Urban Pro, which sells for $85, Night Lights, their Metro 1000 product, which sells for $160, and then the Bright Nights Night Vision 1000, which sells for $120. If you believe these are the competitors to the product that you want to create, then you need to understand how well do these serve the market right now. But what do we do with that data once we find out? It goes right over here in the far right-hand section of our product requirements matrix. This is all about competitive benchmarking. We're going to start filling in the competitor section of the house with your best guess as to how the competition rates on each CCR. Now, we don't have to get too quantitative here, but we can just use an estimated scale from 1 to 5, for instance, that basically says a 5 is great. They greatly exceed the CCR, whereas a 1 means it doesn't meet the CCR at all, and then everything in the middle. Of course, stars work just as well here. We're just trying to get a sense of whether the competitive product meets the CCRs that we're interested in. And once again, you would get that information by looking at customer reviews or perhaps some technical spec sheets. In the template that you're going to be working with, you'll note there's a column for us. And really what I intended for this to be is just to use your existing product as one of the benchmarks, because you may decide that the next generation of product you want to build has to be better than the one you're currently offering. But if that isn't relevant for you, then just keep on going. Treat that as yet another competitor. So what we want to do now is pause the video and assess the competition. What I'd like you to do is to go online and figure out who do you believe are competitors to the bike lights that you're interested in. Take some data and let's see if we can fill this out, maybe with just a couple of stars or perhaps on a scale of 1 to 5. Take a few minutes and we'll come back and move to the next section.
So what we want to do now is pause the video and assess the competition. What I'd like you to do is to go online and figure out who do you believe are competitors to the bike lights that you're interested in. Take some data and let's see if we can fill this out, maybe with just a couple of stars or perhaps on a scale of 1 to 5. Take a few minutes and we'll come back and move to the next section. Well, after all this work, where are we at this point? We've certainly completed the customer need statements, those CCRs, and we've ranked them. We've completed all the performance metrics with the right units associated with them, and we've determined the relationship between the performance metrics and the CCRs.
We've also developed the relative importance of each one of those performance metrics. And as you can imagine, that turns out to be rather significant because that will tell us which of the performance metrics are the most important ones we need to include in our design. We've just taken a look at the competition and done a fairly subjective evaluation to see how they've stacked up to the CCRs. What comes next is we now have to start to fill out the rest of the product requirements matrix down here at the bottom. And this is where we get really quantitative, which hopefully will appeal to our technical backgrounds because this is where we get to be the engineer. To fill out the rest of the diagram, let's start thinking about product positioning once again. Remember, Boulder Blinky is a high-end bicycle components company. That should tell us straight away what kind of positioning we're establishing our bike light to be. The target market is defined as those commuter cyclists. So if we had to put together a high-end bicycle components company with commuter cyclists, what do you think we would end up with? We would expect a light that is performance-driven, designed for cycling at night, be rather bright, also be pretty rugged because it's for commuter cyclists, aesthetically pleasing because I'm guessing commuter cyclists that would be interested in high-end products have probably spent a lot of money on their bicycle. Therefore, they want the components to look pretty nice too. And then anything else that we might come up with. Now that we've established the positioning, we can get more specific about competitive benchmarking. For instance, those three lights that we've talked about once before, the company's Lights Are Us, Night Lights, and Bright Nights, we've defined them to be the competition. Well, we've also taken a look at how they stack up to the CCRs. Now what we have to do is establish how do they rank relative to the performance metrics. Now, if we can, the idea here is to go out and, if possible, get the competitive product, measure it, take it apart, and establish its values relative to those performance metrics we talked about. If you can't just go out and get one, for whatever reason, then
Rate the values from product literature, sheets, and any other sources we can get our hands on. What we're going to do now is see if you can find a spec sheet or two, or maybe even three, of the competitive bike lights in your region. Now that you have some of that information in hand, what we're going to do is start filling out the rest of the matrix. Based on what you found out in your competitive benchmarking analysis, put some values in this area I have outlined below. For example, if the performance metric is light brightness, measured in lumens, and the Night Lights Metro has a brightness of 1000 lumens on its brightest setting, what we would do is put 1000 right there. And the Bright Nights Night Vision has 1200 lumens, so we would put that right there. I think you get the idea. See how many competitive values you can fill out for each of your performance metrics based on some of the data that you've been able to collect. Let's take a minute to do that. You can fill in some of the competitive values that you found, and we'll come back and fill out the section of the diagram.
Donc ici,
Well, how'd that go so far? Feel like you're making some progress? Great. Let's keep going then. Now we get to the last section, where we put in our target values. Your competitive benchmarking analysis tells you what the competition is doing relative to each of those performance metrics. Now, your relative importance scores also tell you which performance metrics are the most important and which are the least important. So now what we have to do is start defining what our target values need to be for those performance factors that you believe are going to
things that really matter to the customer. How do we
bây giờ là Sang tự tin bao nhiêu phần trăm năm nay Arsenal sẽ vô địch? Không, máy tính nó nói gì? Nói bạn đi chứ. Sau trận Man Xanh mới tự tin á. Bây giờ thì cũng có một cái tỷ lệ nào đấy chứ. Tỷ lệ cơ. Chính là Man Xanh nó không phụ thuộc quá vào thằng nào. Các cầu thủ nó được nghỉ đều. Arsenal có cái trục giữa Declan Rice với Joao Mendy này, với cặp trung vệ này, với Saka này là không thằng nào được nghỉ ngơi. Arsenal cái trục trung vệ, cặp trung vệ này, cặp thằng trung tâm này, với lại Saka này, không thằng nào được nghỉ ngơi. Chính ra Eze đá số 10 cũng rất hay. Tính ra là cái chiến thuật là cho hiệp một và cho đội kia là cho mấy thằng nó vào nó quần, không được thì bắt đầu cho mấy thằng chính luôn phiên nghỉ ngơi. Chứ mình thấy Declan Rice nó cày kinh quá. Tiber thì lại không quá quan trọng lắm, có thằng nhiều thằng thay được. Kể ra bên ngoài nó đá vẫn hả?
Do that. Well, let's take a look. Target values. They are the ideal values that your product should have, sometimes bounded by upper and lower limits. For instance, if the light brightness is the most important CCR and the most important performance metric, then we need to be at least as good as the competition, and potentially even better. And if we know
Ôi,
the
mình
Metro
cũng
has a
nhận biết.
brightness of 1000 lumens and the night vision model has a brightness of 1200 lumens,
Hả?
where do you think our target value should be? It probably should not be lower than 1000. It may not necessarily need to be higher than 1200, but it has to be somewhere in that range.
Qua
And whatever
sân
you
sửa
decide,
thì cứ
those
bật
are the
tay.
values that go right here. Let me give you some more help on how to define these target values. There are several ways that you can do this. For example, you could have at least X, which means you're just specifying the design lower limit, or at most X, where you specify the design upper limit. You can do what we just did, where you can say the value needs to be between X and Y, and that specifies an acceptable design range, establishing both the upper and lower limits, like we just did. Or you could say it has to be exactly X, meaning it specifies the design target exactly. Sometimes this might be a little too prescriptive, because it offers no real leeway when it comes to trade-off decisions, like you might encounter.
Được. Ổn quá.
mà. Hello.
Chung một năm mới em. Hả? Anh đi làm hôm thứ hai, giống như bọn em. À, bọn em thứ bảy đúng không? À, Tết Tết vui không em? Đến sang đầu năm đã nhiều việc chưa? Nay mới được nay đầu năm mới mới được ngắm em, còn ở hôm toàn đeo khẩu trang. Đang thích sinh. À, hình như là con gái em thế toàn thế đúng không? trước Tết có lên như thế một lần, gái như thế toàn gái xinh, toàn gái ngoan. Ờ, thấy nó đôi thì càng khỏe ra, khỏe đẹp cũng là đi cùng với nhau. Thì đôi mà lại cơm nắng, nhà em có làm được rõ làm sao? Cấy hay là trồng rừng hay là trồng cây gì? Dạ, giỏi nhỉ. Nghĩ, nghĩ trồng màu nhà anh trồng màu anh thấy oải lắm. Nhà anh trồng màu anh thấy oải lắm này. Cấy bây giờ nó còn nhàn nhạt. Anh quên Nam Định. Nó có gia đình chưa? Cũng xá làm đâu. Chăn nuôi giờ nhiều tiền hơn đi làm. Một đàn là bao nhiêu con? Chả, thế là cũng vất phết nhỉ. Anh quên Nam Định. Ờ, anh ở phía Ninh Bình cơ. Như là từ chỗ anh sang đến cầu Hưng Hà là phải tầm 30 cây. Từ nhà anh ra cầu Hưng Hà phải 30 cây. Có thế chồng đang ở Bắc Giang hay là em quê? À, quê nội ở dưới Thái Bình và chồng đang chăn nuôi ở dưới Thái Bình. À, thế là hai vợ chồng lên Bắc Giang làm ăn. À, anh ấy cứ đang hiểu là quê chồng của em. Thái Bình nhiều cái gì. Hồi xưa chạy là ép Tổng Quang thì là nhà em có cái máy ép to bên thì đi bên này là lúc đấy là dùng 2.5 được 2.6 thì là đi bên này ok rồi, nhưng mà bây giờ sang bên này là kiểu nhà em mua thêm 2.6 là thông số gì đấy? Thông số lực ép ấy, của cái máy ép Tổng Quang này. Máy ép Tổng Quang là gì, có đo lực ép nhỉ? Hiển thị lực ép, hiển thị thông số nó ở trong cái máy đo Tổng Quang là cái máy ép vào đầu lai ấy nhỉ? Vâng, đúng rồi, cái máy ép vào PCB bình thường có ấy đâu nhỉ? Đấy thì là ok rồi, nhưng mà bây giờ nhà em lại kiểu nhà vừa rồi mua một dàn máy nó kiểu máy nhỏ hơn đấy, nhưng mà cái máy nhỏ kia thì dùng cái lực đấy là phải không được, phải muốn lấy cái lực một cái lực cao hơn nữa. phải control hành trình là chủ yếu. Con này là AI Beats à? À đó, UDM Beats. Thế nhá, nhìn cái bảng này em sẽ hiểu là đây là thông tích thông số đường kính của nòng xi lanh. Nòng xi lanh em hiểu rồi đúng không? Ờ, và đây là gì nhỉ? Đây là áp lực áp suất và đây là lực, đây là lực Newton nhé. Thế có giả sử như cùng với cái áp lực của kia em đang để là 0.3, nhìn qua là 0.3 thì với cái nòng 32 nó là 200 Newton, cái nòng 50 nó lên gấp đôi này. Và anh nhìn cái nòng kia nó đang 125 với lại 63. Nếu nếu mà là con số đấy đúng nhá. 63 đây thì cái lực 0.3 nó chỉ là 840, 840. Và nếu mà là cái lực cái nòng là 125 nó lên 3.000, nó gấp gần 4 lần.
Nếu mà thế để con 63 con này lên 63 phải lên
Nhưng mà để xem đúng như anh không chắc cái kia là 125 đâu nhá. Nhưng mà tại vì anh không nhìn thấy, anh nhìn thấy mỗi cái kia nó ghi là phi 125. Nhưng mà cái phi đấy là phi của cái đầu bên dưới, không chắc là nó phi ấy. Nên là em chỉ hỏi lại để chắc chắn. Thế còn con kia như thông số anh đọc thì là 63. Đây 63. Ờ, ví dụ như này là 0.3 này. Nếu mà em để 0.4 nó lên 1.001. Nhưng mà bên kia mà để là 0.4 hoặc 125 nó lên đến 8. Có 4 lần.
con 63 này thì con 63 này thì 0.3 thì ok, còn 0.25 không được. Đấy là
0.3 thì có nghĩa là lực của nó đang phải được này.
vâng tầm 800 là
841.
vâng.
Nhưng mà cái bảng này nó là bảng tham khảo dành chung cho tất cả các hãng. Nếu mà cái ấy của ETAC thì em phải có một bảng riêng. Nhưng mà nó tương đối chính xác, tương đối giống nhau. Mình cứ dùng bảng này không sao. Nhưng mà đây là để em hiểu là tại sao mà con này là 0.3 nó không xuống mà con kia nó lại xuống, vì xi lanh của nó khác nhau. Nếu mà xi lanh nó to hơn, nhìn nó to hơn cái
Con kia là mới
cũng trở ra. Ờ, cái này chắc là em hỏi lại thử cái cơ là ấy nhất. Nhưng mà nếu mà chưa hỏi được thì có thể tham khảo cái số đấy 125.
vâng.
125. Khi 125 thì cũng nằm ở đó. Ví dụ như này còn là 0.3 nó lên 3.400. Thì con đấy nếu mà con này mà 0.3 con 63 mà 0.3 mà xuống được ấy thì con kia chắc chỉ 0.1 nó vẫn xuống được. Nó quá là thì, thì logic là cái lực đấy nó bị được tác động bởi hai thứ, một là cái lòng xi lanh, hai là áp suất khí. Ừ. Thì nên là cái này nó bị cần tính toán. Trong này nó có cái thông số lòng xi lanh là bao nhiêu. Nên là cái việc đấy nó khác biệt là do là đấy là
Bây giờ em muốn thay đổi kiểu trên số lượng trên SOP ấy thì
thế đấy. Thì bây giờ em update cái này thôi. Đây là công đoạn là gì nhỉ? Công đoạn ép cổng quang. Bây giờ theo tính toán là cần lực bao nhiêu. Ví dụ như mình lấy ví dụ nhỉ, ta thấy bên kia nó lực là ta tính toán là cái lực bên kia là nó xuống là ví dụ như nó là 2.000 Newton nhé. Anh lấy ví dụ như nó là 2.000 Newton và bên này thì ta sẽ phải cài đặt như nào đấy để đảm bảo nó đủ 2.000 Newton. Đương nhiên là mình sẽ phải modify đi một tí để cho nó chuẩn. Chả nhẽ chả nhẽ mình bảo nó 2.000 Newton nhưng mà đến lúc 63 này nó phải lên 0.8, nhà máy mình thì không có nào được 0.8. Ừ. Thế nên mình sẽ phải tính như là bên kia nó là 1.000 như nào đấy. Đại loại là anh thấy là bên kia nó quá thừa. Tóm lại là em sẽ phải điều chỉnh không được. Còn đương nhiên với anh quan trọng nhất là gì? Ngoại quan nó xuống, tức là nó đủ lực để nó đẩy xuống và nó không đẩy quá, gây vỡ. Tức là cái quan trọng nhất nó lớn hơn một cái lực nào đấy. Và cái lực đấy là cái lực mà kia nó xuống. Thế còn nếu nó xuống rồi thì phải control về cái độ sâu của nó xuống sâu rồi.
xuống hết đấy kiểu đấy.
Xuống hết.
Em đang có bên nhà em ý em đang muốn bảo sửa đổi thông số thì ý bên nhà em lại muốn phải có một cái mail một bên anh Giang nữa thì bây giờ cũng không biết là em phải làm thế nào nhỉ.
Mail This misstatement should clearly display should
Hi Daniel. Hi Daniel.
Ê, tối nay phải vào cầm chưa? Không mày đến được đâu. Anh chưa được chưa được. Bạn mà cả. Biết thôi, chó nó ở đây nào bạn đi là thôi được không? Đây là nhân dân này. Không về người ta có đã có người này em muốn cả không còn cái gì mà mình mua là cái cửa tăng lên cái sàn nước mới làm sao không là ta phải tay xong rồi con chỉ là còn là bây giờ phát phát thì không mà những cái hàng thì cứ xuất vào ra hoa nhá con một tí bên kia nó tưởng ba không qua được mai như này đi nay lại không cầm cái ấy không đi à? Chứ ai lại tỉnh. Đi đây mai họ mang ra bắt cơm thì rồi rồi.